Hey, night owls. Tonight we're cracking open a chapter of history that smells less like glory and more like moldy socks and betrayal. Let's talk about medieval spies. Not the kind with slick suits and gadgets, but the real, grimy, sleepless ones with ink-stained fingers, crumpled maps, and a constant fear of being disemboweled before breakfast. Forget what the novels told you. Being a spy in the 11th century didn't come with a license to kill. More like a license to run, lie, and maybe die choking on a coded message baked into a loaf of rye bread. So before you wrap yourself in a blanket and drift into the slow hum of medieval misery, hit that like button if conspiracies under candlelight are your thing. Subscribe if you're not afraid of a little blood on parchment. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and how your night's going. I love hearing from our global insomniac squad. Now dim the lights. Let the fan hum like a whispering torch, and settle in as we uncover why it sucked to be a medieval spy. No one in the 11th century proudly declared over a mug of stale ale, "I dream of spying for a minor duke with anger issues and 3 illegitimate sons who all hate me." That's because being a medieval spy wasn't a career. It was punishment with a mission statement. People didn't choose espionage because they were clever. They were chosen because they were invisible, expendable, and had just enough teeth left to hold a secret note under their tongue. Most medieval spies weren't sleek, silver-tongued manipulators fluent in 5 languages and blessed with a flawless memory. They were exhausted messengers, aging stable hands, disgraced monks, or the kind of local healer people avoided because they talked to themselves and smelled like fermented cabbage. These weren't professionals. They were survivors who knew how to listen and forget just as fast. If you had land, a family name, or even a rusty chicken coop, you didn't stoop to spying. You paid someone else to do it. But if your home was a sack of hay in someone else's barn and your reputation was somewhere between drunken thief and missing person, then congratulations. You were getting handed a pouch of coins and a name. Not yours, someone else's. Someone important. Someone you now had to follow without getting stabbed, spotted, or shoved into a ditch. Your target wasn't some grocer from the outskirts of the village. No, your target was likely a rival knight, a rebellious landholder, or even a lady with too many secrets and too few morals. And the reward? Questionable coinage, the promise of more, and the delightful possibility of being tortured by both sides if caught. Because medieval politics wasn't about debate. It was about who could hide a message in a pie and who could find it first. Now let's clear up the first myth right now. There were no formal spy schools in medieval times. No recruitment centers in the woods with log cabins and suspiciously well-armed squirrels. No inspirational speeches by one-eyed generals. You got recruited when someone leaned in during a stormy night and said, "You know things, right?" And suddenly you were being given instructions that made your skin crawl and a satchel that smelled like old turnips and betrayal. Training? That was a joke. If you could read, that was a bonus. If you couldn't, you memorized. Fast. Because sometimes you were carrying more than parchment. Sometimes you had ink-stained skin, or a ring with a hidden compartment, or a message etched into your belt in code that looked like embroidery but meant, "Burn the church on Tuesday." You didn't learn espionage, you adapted, or you vanished. Most didn't last long enough to get good at it. And those who did? They didn't get statues. They got paranoia and arthritis. Let's not forget that medieval messages weren't just scrolls tied with silk. They were etched into wood, whispered across markets, sewn into hems, and occasionally tattooed in secret ink that faded under candlelight. The people you worked for didn't want a message delivered. They wanted deniability. If you were caught, they didn't know you. They didn't hire you. In fact, they might suggest you were a wandering madman who liked to draw symbols on rocks. And guess what? The local authorities would believe them. There was no trial, no appeal, just a pit and some very eager rats. Being a medieval spy wasn't just about gathering secrets, it was about surviving them. You heard things you weren't supposed to, saw things no one should. You watched lords kiss traitors and holy men bless poison, and then you had to pretend like you didn't see any of it, even while shaking in the corner of a barn trying not to vomit from the realization that the world ran on lies and very sharp knives. Let's talk perks. There were none. You didn't get hazard pay. You didn't get retirement. If you were lucky, you got to keep your fingers. If you were really lucky, you died in a place where no one recognized your face, and your last breath didn't involve the phrase, "He knows too much." Most of your tools weren't even tools. You used whatever was on hand. Candle wax to seal secret letters, pig's blood to forge a warning, a flute to signal danger, or a piece of jewelry that meant nothing to anyone but the person who gave it to you. And if you lost it, your next contact wouldn't even look at you. You didn't carry weapons unless you had to, because carrying a blade made people nervous. And nervous people had guards. You learned to kill with words, looks, and if it came down to it, a well-placed kick and a rock. Contacts were unreliable. Half the time, the person you were supposed to meet was dead, drunk, or disguised as a cowherd and refusing to speak unless you knew the password, which was probably something absurd like honey badger moonlight, just to mess with you. And if you got it wrong, you weren't just lost. You were dead. Now imagine you actually did your job. You followed the noble. You learned their secret route. You discovered they were selling information to the enemy under the guise of importing olive oil. You passed this along in a coded message you had to memorize backwards in Latin, then whispered it to a one-eyed beggar pretending to be blind outside a cathedral. Mission complete, right? Wrong. Because now you knew. And knowing meant you were dangerous, and being dangerous meant you had to disappear. Your reward wasn't applause. It was exile, a new name, a distant town, maybe pretending to be a scholar of herbs in a village too poor to care. Every mission, every whisper chipped away at who you were, until one day you couldn't even remember your real name, only the names they gave you, the masks, the roles, the lies. You weren't a person anymore. You were a vessel for secrets that no one wanted but everyone feared. And yet, some did it willingly, not for the coin, not even for the thrill, but because sometimes, just sometimes, the truth was worth the risk. Because someone had to know. Someone had to watch the watchers. There's this modern fantasy that medieval spies were like the chess masters of old, cunning minds playing elaborate games from behind veils of secrecy. But here's the unwashed truth. You didn't become a spy because of talent. You became one because someone higher up noticed that nobody noticed you. You were background noise, a blurry face in the crowd, someone who people forgot as soon as you walked away. And that made you perfect. No applause, no ceremony. Just a quiet conversation after a church service or a rough hand grabbing your collar behind a butcher's stall, and a voice whispering, "I need someone who can disappear." And if you refused? Well, you wouldn't have to worry about it long. Your refusal would be noted, remembered, and suddenly the next morning you'd find yourself accused of theft, heresy, or some made-up charge like conspiring to enchant the village geese. Refusal wasn't an option. Espionage wasn't a job. It was a trap disguised as opportunity. Once you were in, the rules changed. You were no longer a person. You were an asset. Your name was scrubbed. You were given titles like the listener, the runner, the reed, or something poetic that sounded nice on parchment but made your stomach churn when whispered in alleyways. Every time you crossed a town border, you entered a new mask. You pretended to be a tinker, a wandering hymn writer, a healer with mysterious poultices, or even a distant cousin visiting from a war-torn region that hadn't existed for 2 decades. Your only real skill was blending in until you disappeared. And even then, you prayed no one looked twice, because spies didn't have backup. If things went wrong, you either ran, talked, or bled. And the people you reported to? They weren't coming to save you. They were sharpening knives in case you failed. Every mission began with less information than you needed and more risk than you were told. You'd be handed a map that looked like it had been drawn by someone blindfolded during an earthquake, marked with vague phrases like "safe in," or "maybe friendly," "ask about dried figs." The contact you were supposed to meet might be dead, in prison, or worse, turned. There was no vetting process. No official introductions. Just a nod, a phrase, and hope that the person answering didn't mistake you for a threat. If they did, you might be fed hemlock stew with a smile and buried under someone else's name. Movement was the heartbeat of your survival. You couldn't stay in one village for more than a few nights. Too many questions and someone would get curious. And in medieval Europe, curiosity wasn't just dangerous. It was fatal. People believed in curses, omens, and demonic possession. A stranger with too much knowledge could be accused of anything from witchcraft to necromancy. You kept your stories simple, your mannerisms humble, your eyes always lowered just enough to look innocent, but alert enough to spot the nearest exit. Because there were no second chances. If someone decided you didn't belong, you couldn't talk your way out. You had to run, fight, or vanish into smoke that didn't exist. You didn't write letters. Writing was traceable. Ink could betray you. Parchment could be intercepted. Instead, you memorized phrases, patterns, signals, all tattooed into your mind until they replaced actual memories. You forgot birthdays, childhood songs, even your own handwriting, because your brain became a vault for other people's sins. And if you did carry anything written, it was disguised. A recipe with certain letters underlined, a poem with every fourth word carrying meaning, or a prayer with a deadly message hidden between verses, and heaven help you if you dropped it. One lost page could burn a city. Even travel was a nightmare. Roads were dangerous, crawling with bandits, soldiers, or worse, curious patrolmen with nothing to do but question your accent and dig through your bags. You avoided carriages unless absolutely necessary. Horses were fast but noisy. The safest method? Walk, always walk. Long days, aching feet, and sleep in places that smelled like wet hay and rodent tragedy. And through all of this, you couldn't complain. You couldn't scream. You couldn't let your weariness show. Because the moment you did, someone would wonder what a tired tinker was doing with the seal of a noble family tucked under their shirt. Let's talk about your enemies. You weren't just avoiding local guards. You were up against other spies, ones trained to spot imposters, listen to accents, read body language, and quietly report suspicions with a coin and a glance. They didn't wear colors. They didn't announce themselves. They watched, waited, and reported, and if they sniffed you out, you wouldn't even know until it was too late. You'd wake up with cold steel at your throat and someone whispering the wrong name in your ear. And then you'd realize your cover was already dead. There were no allies, no spy network that would rescue you if things went bad. Occasionally, you'd meet another like you, a ragged traveler with haunted eyes and an uncanny knowledge of border towns. Maybe you'd share a fire, trade stories in code, compare scars. But it was never friendly. It was a brief transaction between two ghosts wearing skin. And the moment the embers died, so did the trust. Because spies didn't make friends. Friends asked questions. Friends remembered faces. And faces were dangerous. And despite everything, the loneliness, the danger, the constant fear, you still had to perform. You had to gather useful information. You had to infiltrate meetings you weren't invited to, sneak into homes that didn't belong to you, and listen without breathing when secrets were spilled between bites of roast duck. Sometimes it meant eavesdropping behind tapestries. Sometimes it meant dressing as a servant and scrubbing floors until the nobles forgot you were there. And sometimes it meant seduction, betrayal, and nights spent in someone's bed just to overhear what their heart whispered in sleep. And afterward, you couldn't afford to feel guilt. Guilt was a luxury. You took what you needed and moved on. Because the moment you let yourself feel, you were already compromised. Punishment for failure wasn't just death, it was spectacle. You'd be accused of treason, stripped of dignity, paraded through town squares, tortured for information you no longer had the strength to hide, and finally executed in ways designed to make children cry and mothers faint. You became an example, a reminder to others that secrets belong to the powerful, not the poor. And if you were lucky enough to avoid that fate, you still had to live with the silence, because success meant nothing if no one knew your name, if your victories were erased, if your only legacy was a trail of ashes and a whisper that maybe, just maybe, someone helped change the course of history, and then vanished. And yet, through all this madness, some spies became legends, not because of power, not because of wealth, but because they survived longer than they should have, because they outwitted the liars and double-crossers, because they learned to move through the world like smoke through keyholes. They were never seen, never known, and their stories, when told, sounded like myths. Shadows on castle walls, eyes behind stained glass, a slip of parchment found in a grave no one remembered digging. They didn't seek fame, they didn't crave reward. They just wanted to live long enough to see the next full moon. And sometimes that was the closest thing to victory they'd ever get. Let's talk about your gear. Not the kind you'd see on the belt of a fantasy rogue or hiding in a noble's treasury chest. Forget daggers with names, enchanted rings, or cloaks woven by blind witches in northern caves. The medieval spy's toolkit was whatever you could carry, steal, or fake. Your survival didn't depend on gear, it depended on instinct. The kind of gut feeling that kept you from knocking over a jug in a silent hall, or reminded you which wineskin had the ink-dissolving tincture and which one had the rat poison. There were no issued kits, no quartermasters, no catalog of espionage supplies. You adapted constantly with whatever the dirt-covered world handed you that day. If you were lucky, and I mean found a purse in a grave and nobody was looking lucky, you might have carried a small blade. Nothing ornate, no carvings, just a shard of metal barely held together by a rotting hilt and sheer willpower. It wasn't meant for battle, it was meant for silence. A quick slit of rope, a distracted guard's throat, or carving a message into wood if ink was too risky. But most spies didn't even get that. They carried pins, sewing needles, broken keys. They relied on sharp wit and sharper timing, because when your weapon was improvisation, hesitation was death. Maps were never reliable. You couldn't carry anything too detailed. It would mark you as suspicious. Most of the time, your directions were verbal, sketched in memory. Head east until the soil darkens. Find the twisted willow. Walk 20 paces past the old grave. That was a map. And heaven help you if someone moved the landmarks or you were sent during a fog. So you memorized routes like lullabies, etched them into your brain like scars. You didn't get lost because you couldn't afford to. Ink was currency. Ink meant information. A vial of good ink could cost more than a pig and was harder to get. Most spies had their own recipes. Ash mixed with wine, crushed berries, iron flakes from rusted nails. Whatever left a mark and didn't fade when the parchment sweated in your cloak. And if you couldn't write, you used ciphers. Knots in string, scratches on clay, musical notes that weren't quite right, a recipe for stew that, when read backward, revealed the location of a hidden arsenal. You weren't just carrying information, you were the information. And if you died, your body might be searched for tattoos, hidden ink, or even encoded bruises made to look like accidents. Food, of all things, was one of your greatest liabilities. You couldn't afford to eat or drink without suspicion. Every meal had the potential to be your last, not because of poisons, though those were real, but because sitting too long at one table meant someone would start asking your name. So you snacked in corners, ate from your own stash if you had it, and always watched the hands of whoever served you. Paranoia wasn't a condition, it was protocol. Because spies didn't die from swords, they died from questions. Who are you traveling with? Where are you headed? Didn't I see you in Hurstwood 2 months ago? And one wrong answer was enough to put your head on a pike. Let's not forget the most important tool of all, your disguise. And no, it wasn't a black cloak or an enchanted ring that made you invisible. It was a crusty tunic, a limp, a fake stutter. It was convincing people you were beneath their notice. You became the man who mucked stables, the mute woman who swept the cathedral steps, the foreign merchant with cracked sandals and a story about spices no one had ever tasted. You never looked important. You looked tired, hungry, slightly dazed. You looked like someone people wanted to walk past, and if someone did notice you, you smiled with empty eyes and gave them a name you hadn't used in 5 years. And when they blinked, you were gone. You didn't just disguise yourself, you became the disguise. You studied the habits of every role you played. How a shepherd walks after years in the hills. How a kitchen hand holds a ladle. How a messenger smells after 3 days on the road. You practiced sneezing like a sick monk. You mimicked the way a noble servant bowed too low and avoided eye contact. And you did it all without instruction. No acting coach, no mentor, just observation, repetition, and the sheer terror of getting it wrong. And yes, sometimes your role required something darker. Pretending to be a scribe meant you had to forge. Pretending to be a healer meant giving fake diagnoses. Sometimes you posed as someone who could offer hope, a prophet, a deliverer, a long-lost cousin, only to betray that hope the moment your job was done. That was the cost of the mission. That was the reality of staying alive. Messages themselves weren't always written. Sometimes they were delivered through stories, songs, or even riddles. You'd walk into a tavern, pretend to be a bard, and sing a ballad about a river overflowing. Anyone who knew the code understood it meant a siege was coming. If someone clapped at the wrong verse, you knew they were listening. And if they didn't, well, sometimes you sang to empty ears. Or worse, to spies of the other side. And you had to keep smiling through every note because flinching would mean someone knew you were more than you appeared. But not every spy worked in shadows. Some walked proudly in the courts of power, whisperers, courtiers, jesters who joked about affairs they weren't supposed to know. These were the high-risk spies, the ones who danced too close to fire but wore masks so convincing even their own allies doubted them. And when they fell hard. Nobles didn't execute them quietly. They made it public, made it loud. Because betrayal hurt worse when it came from someone who had smiled at your table. And what about escape? Let's say you delivered the message. You found the traitor. You stole the plans. You had to leave now. How? Roads were watched. Inns were gossipy death traps. And if your horse had been taken or spooked, you were on foot, bleeding, running through forests where wolves weren't the only things with teeth. You had to know every hidden path, every sympathetic farmhand, every priest willing to lie for a coin or a secret. And even then, it wasn't guaranteed. Because sometimes the best escape was hiding in plain sight, pretending to be a grieving widow, pretending to be dead. Spies didn't just live in fear of enemies. They feared time itself. The longer a mission stretched, the greater the risk. Every hour was another chance for exposure. Every sunrise was a ticking clock. Because secrets were like milk in the sun, eventually they curdled. Someone would talk, someone would guess, someone would remember your face when they shouldn't have, and then you'd feel that weight in your chest, the moment you knew you'd stayed too long. The mission was done, but you weren't. Now, you were a hunted secret, and the cruelest part? You were never thanked, not truly. Your name wouldn't be remembered. Your deeds wouldn't be sung. The general who won the war would get credit. The noble who prevented the assassination would toast to our silent protectors with a wink, never naming the woman who died in a cellar to get the intel. You were a ghost, a necessary ghost. And if you ever dared tell your story, even years later, in a quiet tavern, far from the war, people would laugh. You? A spy? They'd say, smiling like you'd told a joke. Go on then. Sing us a song. And you would. But it wouldn't be the truth. Because the truth was buried under names that weren't yours. Lies that saved lives, and the kind of loneliness that hollowed out your soul like rot in an old apple. Being a medieval spy wasn't noble. It wasn't thrilling. It wasn't glamorous. It was a slow, grinding disappearance, one step at a time, until nothing remained but silence and secrets. Let's get something straight. Medieval spies didn't operate in cozy libraries or smoky war rooms with polished tables and crystal goblets. No. Their battlegrounds were chaotic halls dripping with arrogance and ambition. Their targets weren't idle villagers or lazy merchants with too many debts. They were figures carved from the stone of influence, lords, military commanders, merchants too rich for their own good, bishops with more gold than piety, or foreign emissaries pretending to drink too much wine while listening to everything. These targets weren't just hard to reach. They were encased in layers of protection, paranoia, and privilege. Getting close to them wasn't about force. It was about patience, mimicry, and playing a part so convincingly that even you forgot who you were. Reaching a target started long before the meeting. It began with observation. You followed from a distance, learned their routines, how they walked, where they dined, who they smiled at, and who they hated in silence. You learned their favorite drink, the names of their dogs, how often they switched sleeping quarters, and whether or not they trusted their steward. And this wasn't done with a telescope from a nearby tower. This was done while you carried baskets past their estate, while you posed as a lantern boy during their evening rides, while you polished floors and overheard whispered threats between sighs and clinking cups. You existed on the fringe of their world, gathering everything until the moment came to slip inside. But even when you were close, even when you were breathing the same air, success was never guaranteed. These people were trained to be suspicious. They'd survived wars, uprisings, and betrayals. They didn't shake hands without wondering if the other person had a blade under their sleeve. Many employed food tasters, used doubles, or rotated their staff regularly to ensure no one got too comfortable. Some targets would speak in riddles, never reveal plans aloud, or make important decisions in confessional booths, safe under the illusion of holiness. Trying to extract anything from them was like catching smoke with a net. And if you did get lucky, you had to vanish before they sensed a shift in the wind. And let's not underestimate their protection. Nobles didn't walk around alone. Even minor figures often traveled with guards, dogs, assistants, and sometimes a drunk cousin whose only job was to start a scene if things got tense. You weren't sneaking into a barn to eavesdrop on lovers. You were entering fortresses guarded by soldiers who would rather kill first and ask forgiveness later. And these weren't just random toughs. They were often former soldiers, mercenaries with blood on their hands, men and women who noticed everything from the angle of your posture to how long you looked at a hallway. They were trained to spot threats before the threats knew they were threats. Now imagine this. You finally reached the room. You've navigated past guards, bribed a chambermaid with your last coin, and posed as a falconer from a non-existent duchy. You're inside. The target speaks. Maybe they're drunk, maybe they're mourning, maybe they just need someone to rant at. They reveal something. Treason, movement of troops, plans for marriage that could upset an entire alliance. It's gold. Information that could alter the future. But you can't react. You must nod, wipe your hands like you're cleaning plates, and leave without a twitch. Because if your eyebrow lifts a little too high, they'll know. If you smile at the wrong moment, you'll hang by mourning. And assuming you get out, what now? You can't run to your employer. You can't light a torch and yell victory. You have to leave slowly, maybe finishing your shift, maybe disappearing during the changing of the watch. And then, you become mist. Your face forgotten. Your steps erased by the next servant's mop. Because if even one person remembers you, your mission isn't over. It's failed. And the punishment for failure in espionage was never a simple death. It was demonstration, display. They wanted people to remember what happened when someone played the game and lost. But not all missions ended in information. Sometimes, you were the trap. Not the spy, but the bait. You were placed into the home of a political enemy to tempt, to mislead, to distract. You played the charming cook, the sympathetic guard, the bored librarian with more questions than answers. And while you asked where the treasury keys were kept, someone else stole the blueprints from under their bed. You were disposable, designed to take the fall if things went sideways. Sometimes the plan was for you to be caught, just long enough to throw suspicion in the wrong direction, to buy time for the real operation to succeed. And if you survived that, you weren't rewarded. You weren't pulled from the field and given a warm bed and a new life. You were cleaned, dressed in a new identity, and thrown back into the fire. Because the moment you proved you could survive, they decided you could survive again. You became the weapon that never got to rest. And the longer you played, the harder it became to remember what was real. What memories were yours? Which lies you were still telling? Which feelings you were faking? And which ones had slowly begun to feel like the truth? Sometimes you became emotionally entangled. You got too close to someone while undercover. A maid who reminded you of a sister. A captain who spoke kindly to you for no reason. And deep down, you knew you might have to betray them. Use them. Or worse, Watch them die because of something you said, or didn't say, or because you dared to care for once. That's the rot that lived in your chest. The guilt that never washed away. You learned to silence it, to smile with dead eyes, to hold your breath when names were called at dawn, because in your line of work, a heartbeat too slow meant a blade too fast. And sometimes the targets weren't enemies. They were allies suspected of betrayal, people you liked, trusted. You were sent not to extract information from a stranger, but to observe a friend, to dig through their belongings, listen at their door, note the way they hesitated during prayer. You became their shadow, praying you wouldn't find what you were looking for. But when you did, when the evidence was undeniable, when the letters or symbols or gold meant only one thing, you reported it. You ended them, and then sat alone by a riverbank wondering if your silence would have changed anything. And the worst part? You were often manipulated yourself, fed lies, sent on wild errands to test your loyalty or occupy you while real events unfolded. You were told one thing only to discover months later that the person you delivered to death was innocent, that your handler wanted them gone for personal gain, that the message you memorized in code was actually a trigger for a massacre, and you were complicit, a pawn, a tool wielded without consent, but still responsible, still guilty, because your job wasn't to ask why, it was to do, and history didn't care about context. So you buried the regret, swallowed the confusion, and kept walking, because that's what spies did. They endured, alone, exhausted, haunted, and never stopped moving. By now you understand that being a medieval spy wasn't just a job. It was a sentence, often lifelong, and almost always fatal in one way or another. But what most people never consider is the cost that doesn't come from daggers or betrayal or poisoned bread. It's the silence. The endless, gnawing, unbearable silence of living a life where every word you speak could become your last. You didn't just hide from enemies. You hid from yourself. Every day was a performance, and the longer the act continued, the more you forgot where the mask ended and your real face began. Silence wasn't just strategic. It was enforced. You couldn't confide in anyone, not truly. A single wrong word, one misjudged moment of vulnerability, could spiral into suspicion. So, you learned to live in your head. You built mazes in your thoughts, chambers where your emotions were locked behind metaphorical iron doors. You didn't laugh unless it was rehearsed. You didn't cry because tears left a trail. You didn't hope because hope made you hesitate. And hesitation was death. You trained your body to sleep lightly, your ears to wake before your eyes, and your smile to mean nothing at all. The world didn't mourn your kind. When you vanished, killed, exiled, or broken, there were no memorials, no ballads sung by firelight. You were forgotten deliberately. Your name scrubbed from records, your existence denied by those who once depended on you. It was safer that way. And even if someone did remember, it was as a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to young apprentices. Don't end up like her, they'd say, the one who knew too much and said too little. If your story survived, it survived as a warning, not a legacy. And for the rare few who managed to survive for more than a decade in the shadows, the cost became heavier than any blade. You started to forget the sound of your real voice. You couldn't recall the last time you'd spoken your birth name aloud. Your dreams were cluttered with code, with the sound of boots echoing on stone, with shadows flickering under door frames. You found yourself checking the corners of rooms out of habit, even when you were alone. Especially when you were alone, because spies learned early that the worst betrayals came when no one else was watching. You couldn't form attachments. Relationships were liabilities. A friend might be followed. A lover might ask questions. A child might wonder why their parent never stays longer than a week. So you kept your distance. You crafted identities that didn't need closeness. The kind merchant who travels often. The quiet healer who avoids crowds. The wandering scholar who always finds another city to study. You left tokens behind. Stories that could be remembered in your place but never the truth. You were always moving, always halfway packed, always ready to run. Even in the rare moments of peace, your heart never stopped calculating escape routes. And then there was the body, the physical toll. Spies weren't fed well. You survived on scraps, on root vegetables and dried meat, and whatever could be carried without spoiling. Your joints ached from sleeping on uneven ground. Your lungs wheezed from too many nights spent in smoke-filled taverns and cold cellars. You carried wounds no one saw. A broken rib that healed wrong after a scuffle. A cut that left a permanent limp. Fingers that shook from years of adrenaline without rest. Your body became a worn map of every mission, every narrow escape. And there was no healing, no time to rest. You patched yourself up with herbs, with needle and thread, with desperate prayers whispered into stolen silence. Emotionally, it was even worse. The weight of what you did, what you had to do, never left. You could smile and laugh and blend in, but the guilt sat behind your eyes like smoke in a ruined temple. You remembered every face, every lie, every moment you could have walked away and didn't. You remembered the trusting looks, the hands that reached for you, the voices that believed your story, right up until the blade fell. And sometimes it wasn't even a blade. Sometimes it was your silence that damned them. You could have warned them, could have left a clue, but you didn't. You couldn't. Because the mission mattered more. Because you were trained to believe that. Or worse, you told yourself that after the fact to sleep better. And still, with all this suffering, you stayed in the game. Because once you stepped into that life, there was no stepping out. There was no retirement, no farm in the country, no peaceful life by the sea. If you tried to walk away, you became a threat. You knew too much. You could be used by the enemy, even unintentionally. So they'd find you, even years later. A knock at the door. A familiar face in a new town. A merchant who stared just a little too long at your hands, and just like that, you were back in the maze, running again, hiding again, lying again. Sometimes, though, you got out the other way. Death in the field. Quick, clean, and unspectacular. Or slow and quiet. Forgotten in a plague house where no one asked names. You weren't killed by blades or poison. You were killed by time, by erosion, by the weight of too many secrets. No final words, no audience. Just the end of a story no one ever knew was being told. And yet, there were moments, small flickers in the dark, moments when the wind caught just right, and you stood on a hilltop looking out at the world you helped protect. No one knew, of course. The village below was safe because of something you whispered 3 winters ago. The children played freely because of a plan you'd derailed in a distant court. You watched, silently, as life unfolded untouched by the chaos you'd spent your own life navigating. You didn't need thanks, but in that moment you remembered why you did it, why you endured. Because even if no one would ever know your name, you had made a difference. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest comfort of all. In the world of medieval espionage, there was no greater enemy than betrayal. Not from those you spied on, but from those you trusted. And trust, in this profession, was the rarest currency of all. If gold was what you risked your neck for, and secrets were what you whispered in dark corners, then trust was the invisible thread stretched tightly across every mission. Fragile, silent, always one wrong word away from snapping. Because no matter how loyal you thought someone was, no matter how many messages you'd smuggled or nights you'd shared with your back to the same cold stone wall, there was always that creeping question: what if they've already sold you out? You see, medieval spycraft wasn't built on camaraderie. It was a game of manipulation, leverage, and mutually assured destruction. Double agents weren't the exception, they were the rule. Your contact in the capital. He might be taking payment from both sides. The smuggler who swore to deliver your package might have already traded it for his own freedom. Even your handler, the one person who gave you orders, might be feeding you lies to protect themselves. No one played straight. No one told the full truth. Everyone had something to hide, and the best spies were the ones who could lie convincingly to themselves about who was really loyal. Let's say you were sent to a coastal city to monitor a baron who'd grown too fond of foreign ships and foreign gold. You make contact with a local informant, someone with access to port records and servants who talk too much. They seem reliable. They share names, dates, shipments. You cross-reference everything. It checks out. You begin to trust them just a little. Then comes the moment they ask something of you. A letter smuggled out. A meeting arranged. A person followed. It all seems harmless, routine. Until 3 days later, a colleague of yours turns up dead in the river, face down, with a message carved into his chest in a language you barely recognize. That's when it hits you. The information you gave wasn't neutral. It was bait. And you weren't the hunter. You were the lure. Betrayal didn't always come with blood and drama. Sometimes it was a quiet absence, a meeting that never happened, a door that didn't open, a safe house that was suddenly crawling with guards. You'd stand in the shadows trying to piece together what had gone wrong, tracing every conversation, every nod, every too friendly smile. And the answer was always the same. Someone you trusted had turned. You just didn't know when. And what made betrayal worse was that it didn't even have to be malicious. Sometimes people broke under pressure. Your allies had lives too, families, debts, wounds that didn't heal. The torture chambers of the medieval world weren't just physical. They were psychological. Starvation, isolation, a whispered promise of freedom if you gave up just one name. And when someone cracked, it didn't always look like a confession. Sometimes it looked like hesitation, a moment of doubt, a pause too long when someone asked, "Do you know him?" That was all it took. The machine of paranoia would spin into motion, and you would suddenly find yourself hunted by those you once protected. The hardest betrayal, though, was the one that came from within, the slow erosion of your own morality. You started out believing in something, justice, freedom, protection of the realm. But over time, after enough lies and losses, after being forced to watch innocent people suffer because the mission mattered more, you started to bend. You made deals you would have never made 5 years ago. You lied to allies because the truth was inconvenient. You sacrificed a village because the alternative was a war. And you justified it. You had to. Because if you stopped to face what you were becoming, you might not have been able to keep going. Self-betrayal was the most dangerous form. Because it wasn't fast or obvious, it crept in like rot under floorboards. You told yourself it was just one mission, one necessary evil, one life to save hundreds. But then one became 2, then 10, and soon you were making choices not because they were right, but because they were easy. Because they kept you alive. Because they made the pain stop. For a while. And the system didn't help. The people who ran things, the nobles, the warlords, the secret councils, they counted on betrayal. They cultivated it like crops. They pitted spies against each other, fed false intel just to see who would leak it, used you to test their own circle of advisors. You were never just a spy. You were a tool in a greater game of manipulation where even your failure could be part of someone else's success. And when you realized that, truly understood it, it hollowed you out, made you cynical, made you cold. That warmth you once carried, the belief that you were doing good, it faded like breath in winter. But here's the part no one likes to admit. Sometimes betrayal worked. Sometimes flipping someone saved hundreds of lives. Sometimes revealing a double agent prevented a coup. You could never predict it, could never rely on it. But when it happened, it reminded you why you were still in the game. Because even in a world drowning in deception, truth had weight. It had impact. And if you could find it, even once, you could hold on to that moment like a lifeline. There were even occasions when you had to become the betrayer, when your orders required it, when a trusted contact had to be sacrificed to preserve a bigger plan. It tore at you, made you question everything, but you did it. Because hesitation killed more spies than any sword ever could. And the worst part? You couldn't even mourn them. Couldn't whisper an apology or leave a flower. You had to pretend it never happened. Had to smile at the next target like your hands weren't still shaking from the last one. And so you built walls inside yourself. Fortresses of emotion where nothing could reach you. You became the mask full time. You laughed at betrayal because it was safer than crying. You memorized lies faster than names. You walked into danger not because you were brave, but because you no longer feared dying. And in that terrifying clarity, you became effective, efficient, lethal, and very, very alone. To survive in the business of secrets, you had to become something less than real, an echo, a moving shadow, a face that changed so many times even mirrors stopped recognizing you. Disguise was more than fabric and posture. It was the language of camouflage woven deep into your bones. In the Middle Ages, you didn't have access to prosthetics or makeup kits. No fake mustaches curled just right, or theatrical tricks with stage lighting. You had rags, grime, posture, and the oldest performance tool of all, your body. You turned it into whatever the mission needed. Hunchbacked beggar, stoic clerk, mute bell ringer, traveling relic peddler whose relics were suspiciously fresh and frequently stolen. You didn't wear a costume. You became it, wholly and absolutely, because the tiniest inconsistency could get you dragged out into the daylight by men with pikes and righteous fury in their eyes. You didn't just put on a new tunic or trade shoes with a corpse behind the stables. You immersed yourself in the life that came with it. If you pretended to be a novice monk, you had to know the daily prayers, the layout of the abbey, the smell of incense, and the names of the abbots who had died decades ago, but were still referenced in drunken chants after Vespers. If you claimed to be a grain merchant, you had to talk about crop rotation, weather trends, storage rot, and why the last harvest failed 3 miles north of the river. If you didn't, someone would notice, because people in medieval society were paranoid in the most dangerous way. They were curious in short bursts and violent in long ones. And the hardest part? You couldn't just copy someone. You couldn't dress as a real person and assume their identity unless you were absolutely sure they wouldn't be seen again. Too many spies met their end because they borrowed the wrong face. A miller whose brother rode into town that very morning. A soldier whose wife had been looking for him. A priest whose sermons were too distinct to fake. It wasn't just about fooling the guards, it was about fooling the gossip. Because in a medieval village, news traveled faster than horses. And suspicion traveled faster than that. Disguises weren't merely outfits, they were entire personas. You built them from the ground up. You practiced voices in the dark, walking styles, dominant hands, speech patterns. You learned regional dialects, how certain towns swore, how nobles in one province blessed their wine differently than others. And you used it. Every detail was a shield. Every flaw you mimicked made you more convincing. You could be a limping herbalist with a crooked smile and a missing finger, and as long as your story stayed consistent, people believed you. Because belief was easier than confrontation. People didn't want to think they were in the presence of a threat. They wanted to assume you were just another unfortunate soul scraping through life. And that was your greatest weapon. But even the best disguise didn't last forever. Clothes wore down. Accents slipped. A familiar face showed up at the wrong tavern. And when the cracks started to show, you had two options: vanish or own the suspicion. Some spies mastered this, turning the accusation into mockery. Spy? Me? I can't even spell my own name. Others leaned into superstition, pretending to be cursed, haunted, or mad, because in the medieval mind, those were more believable than a foreign agent lurking in their village. It's strange, isn't it? You could avoid death by pretending to talk to invisible spirits, but if someone found an unfamiliar coin in your pouch, you'd be sentenced before the rooster crowed. And let's not forget the roles that came with deeper risks. There were those spies who played nobles. Not minor ones, but key players in local politics. Impersonating a distant cousin of a merchant lord or posing as a disgraced knight who'd returned from exile. These were the high-wire acts of espionage. You were surrounded by people who should know better. One mistake, a gesture done wrong, a family name mispronounced, a feast custom skipped, and you'd be exposed. The rewards for pulling it off were immense. Access to plans, personal letters, bedrooms where strategies were whispered between sighs. But if you failed, you didn't just die. You became the lesson. Executed slowly, publicly, loudly. So everyone remembered what happened to the ones who played too high. Then there were the gender disguises. In a world that viewed roles rigidly, gender became an unexpected weapon. Women posed as boys to move more freely in spaces forbidden to them. Men feigned widowhood to pass unnoticed in female quarters. A spy who mastered the art of crossing lines society never questioned could move almost anywhere. You could gather gossip in the kitchens, linger near bridal preparations, sit in corners where secrets danced freely under veils of assumed innocence. You used what the world ignored to your advantage. But it came with danger. Discovery didn't just mean death. It meant disgrace, punishment magnified by fury and humiliation. Society punished deception, but it especially punished those who blurred the lines it relied on to feel safe. And for all the effort, the risks, the lives you built and discarded like old tunics, you gained nothing lasting. You couldn't keep the identity, not even the pieces that made you feel safe. You couldn't stay in a town you liked, couldn't keep the friendships forged while pretending to be someone else. Every connection, every bit of stability, had a countdown ticking under it, because no matter how well the disguise worked, it had an expiration date. One day someone would ask the wrong question. Someone would come looking. Someone would remember your face. And the name you'd given wouldn't match the story they'd heard from the tax clerk, so you moved on. Always moving, always becoming. You lived dozens of lives, and yet you owned none of them. And in the end, when you sat alone in some nameless inn on the outskirts of a kingdom you couldn't remember betraying or saving, you'd whisper names to yourself. Not real ones, but the ones that got you through the nights. The shepherd who sang in the market. The mute guard in the archbishop's court. The mother of three who sold beads and passed notes to revolutionaries. All of them you. All of them nobody. Because in the world of medieval spies, identity was not a gift. It was a debt, and it always came due. If there was a signature mark of medieval espionage, something whispered with dread in candlelit corners and scribbled hastily on scraps of intercepted parchment, it was poison. That mythical substance capable of toppling kings, turning feasts into funerals, and changing the tides of power without ever drawing a blade. But if you think poison was the glamorous, elegant tool of silent assassins and cunning agents, let me remind you that medieval poison was chaos bottled and served with guesswork. It wasn't science. It was madness wrapped in superstition, and every drop carried more danger to the user than the victim. Let's begin with the basics. Poisons weren't crafted in state-of-the-art laboratories by learned scholars in clean robes with gloved hands and sanitized utensils. They were mixed in underground hovels, stirred in cracked bowls, brewed over fires that also cooked your dinner. The ingredients? Whatever nature offered that looked suspicious and didn't taste like it should be eaten. Crushed hemlock, foxglove, belladonna, arsenic scraped from mine walls, fungus found under the corpses of animals. Sometimes the recipes were passed down from traveler to thief to apothecary, each version more unstable than the last. Sometimes they were invented on the spot, based on the color of the sky and whether the toad used in the mixture had croaked in a full moon. And even when it worked, it rarely worked the way you intended. A poison meant to bring quiet sleep might instead produce days of hallucinations, vomiting, and loud public suffering. A tincture designed to paralyze might kill instantly, or not at all, or it might just give the target a limp and a lifelong vendetta. That was the risk. There were no reliable dosages, no precision tools, no way to test without killing something or someone first. And since test subjects weren't exactly easy to come by without arousing suspicion, most spies relied on luck, bad intuition, and desperation. Delivery was a nightmare of its own. Unlike what legends suggest, you didn't casually tip a flask into a wine goblet under the table while winking at the camera. Every noble worth targeting had guards, tasters, dogs, sometimes all three. Meals were inspected, prayers were said over food, and certain lords even kept relics nearby they claimed would darken in the presence of sin, or worse, poison. There were cases where food had to pass through a chain of hands longer than the ingredients list, and even then it was tasted by a servant who had been carefully trained to die quietly if need be. Imagine that. You risk your life to slip a trace amount of monkshood into a stew, and the only result is a kitchen boy vomiting into the hearth and being replaced by mourning. So, you adapted. You didn't always aim for death. Sometimes you poisoned information. Letters coated with residue that burned the skin, ink that caused blindness, wax seals made with toxic ash. Sometimes you poisoned trust. Spread rumors that the wine was tainted. Let your target become paranoid enough to change their behavior, cancel a meeting, or delay a signing just long enough for your allies to act. In the world of spycraft, poison was less about the kill and more about the shift. If you couldn't destroy your target's body, you destroyed their mind. But paranoia had a way of spreading like wildfire. You didn't even need to use poison to create panic. Just the rumor of it. Just a well-timed whisper at a market stall or a misplaced vial found under a bed could lead to lockdowns, interrogations, and executions. And every time someone got sick from bad meat or fever, fingers pointed. Suddenly you had 3 dead cooks, a burned pantry, and a baron so paranoid he only drank snowmelt collected by virgins at dawn. You could break a kingdom's nerve with nothing more than a few herbs and a terrified look. Of course, the deeper you played with poison, the more it began to haunt you. Every meal you ate, every sip of water, every breath around incense could be your last. Spies who trafficked in toxins became increasingly isolated. Some refused to eat with others, cooked their own food, even tested their water on stray cats. Others became addicted to microdosing, taking trace amounts of poison daily to build immunity, a risky practice that more often led to tremors, hallucinations, organ failure, and, ironically, an inability to taste the very dishes they were trying to taint. You became your own test subject, your own executioner, your own antidote, or your own mistake. And yes, there were antidotes, but they were about as reliable as medieval medicine in general, which is to say, not very. Some were herbs meant to flush toxins. Others were superstitions, blessed stones worn near the liver, amulets carved from river bones, powders taken while chanting backwards at the moon. A few might have helped. Most were placebos wrapped in hope, and when they failed, the consequences were merciless. A spy who misjudged their dose didn't get a second chance. They got a swift, painful death, and a burned body to hide the evidence. Still, poison remained one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal, not because it was perfect, but because it was feared. Fear gave it power. Fear made people cancel meetings, stop traveling, mistrust their servants. You didn't need to kill to change history. You only needed someone powerful to believe they were a target. You could destabilize entire regions with one mysterious death. You could end alliances, delay wars, force confessions, shatter loyalties. Poison wasn't the blade that cut. It was the silence before the scream, the shadow at the feast, the reason no one could sleep. And sometimes, the real poison wasn't even in the cup. It was in the idea. The realization that no one could be trusted, that even the air might be deadly, that even the person smiling across the table might be watching your throat instead of your words. Spies weaponized this fear. They didn't need to slip arsenic into your bread. They just needed you to believe they might. And once that seed was planted, you began to destroy yourself, one sleepless night at a time. You've done the job. The message was delivered. The right person died, or the right secret reached the wrong ears. And just like that, the mission is over, or so it seems. But in the life of a medieval spy, there was no such thing as clean closure. Success didn't come with medals or rewards or even a warm handshake from a grateful noble. It came with suspicion, more silence, and the immediate need to vanish. Because the second you succeeded was the same moment you became the most dangerous person alive. Not to your enemies, but to your employer. You knew too much. And in this game, knowledge wasn't power. It was a target painted between your shoulder blades. The moment the deed was done, your role shifted from infiltrator to liability. You'd just proven you could bypass guards, manipulate servants, twist lies into loyalty, and strike where no one thought possible. And that scared people, even those who paid you, especially those who paid you. They'd watch you from behind castle windows, nodding in praise while already planning how to erase you before the scent of blood dried on your boots. Not out of cruelty, but out of caution. A good spy was an asset. A surviving one was a risk. And if you were too competent, too precise, too invisible, that was reason enough for someone to sharpen a blade in your honor. So you didn't linger. You didn't wait for recognition. You left. Fast. Through the kitchen, past the latrine, over the outer wall using the rope you hid 4 days earlier when the plan was still forming. You ran until your legs gave out, then walked until your boots bled, and only when the stars shifted overhead and no dogs barked in your direction did you even think about resting. That was the rhythm. Do the job. Survive the success. Erase yourself before someone else did it for you. And then came the aftermath, the exhausting, endless dance of reinvention. You couldn't go back to your old face, your old voice, your old town. You became someone else again. Maybe a brewer looking for apprenticeships. Maybe a widow passing through to visit a shrine. Maybe a mute laborer rebuilding the wall of a town recently cleansed by plague. You walked into a new life like it was a costume, and you wore it as long as it fit. But the weight of the kill, the mission, the fear, the whispers, clung to you like mold on bread. It never left. It never faded. It only grew heavier the longer you stayed in one place. Even safe houses weren't safe. You'd find a dusty room in a village barely marked on any map, a spot that someone swore was secure. And for a while you believed it. You'd light a candle, eat some stale bread, sleep without a dagger in hand. But then you'd see the same face twice in the market. A stranger with too clean a cloak. A priest who asked your name twice in the same sentence. And just like that, the illusion of safety shattered. You packed, disappeared, burned the aliases behind you, and started again. Not because someone was chasing you, but because they might be. And the fear of being hunted was often worse than the real thing. And if you were being hunted, the signs were subtle. A locked door that shouldn't be. A question asked too directly. A price shift at an inn that suggested your arrival was noted. You never looked for men in armor, too obvious. You looked for the woman who stopped singing when you entered. The boy who ran too fast after looking at you. The butcher who used to greet you and now didn't. Paranoia wasn't a reaction, it was strategy, and it kept you breathing. Payment, of course, was its own insult. Sometimes you were paid up front, which meant you worked knowing the moment the job was done, the employer had no reason to keep you alive. Other times you were promised coin after completion. A terrible deal, because the job was proof of your effectiveness, and no one wanted a living reminder of what they'd ordered. So you'd meet your handler in a dark alley, maybe a barn, maybe under a bridge while pretending to fish, and they'd hand over a small pouch with far fewer coins than agreed. Maybe you took it and walked. Maybe you demanded more. Maybe they tried to stab you on the spot. It was never clean. It was never fair. And it always ended with one of you limping away. Sometimes the job wasn't even real. It was bait. You were hired not to assassinate or infiltrate, but to be caught. To distract the enemy. To test a trap. Or worse, to be discredited in public so that your employer could deny involvement. They'd send you in with false information, knowing you'd be interrogated, knowing you'd break, knowing your story would discredit real intelligence. You were never told. You were never warned. You found out only when the plan made no sense. The escape route was missing, and your contacts stared at you with eyes that said, "I'm sorry, but you were never supposed to walk away." And yet sometimes you did. You crawled through mud, swam freezing rivers, hid under wagons. You lived, and that was enough. No glory, no reward. Just one more day to breathe, to rest in an alley without being chased, to look at a rising sun and whisper to yourself, "Still here?" You didn't celebrate. You didn't brag. You didn't even relax. Because survival wasn't a moment. It was a process. 1,000 tiny choices, each one keeping you 2 inches ahead of death. But success was lonely. You couldn't tell anyone. Couldn't share the story, the fear, the triumph. If you did, they wouldn't believe you. Or worse, they would. And then they'd become targets too. So you sat in quiet inns with your hood up, listening to travelers retell rumors of what you did. Wrong names, wrong details. but close enough that your heart clenched. You wanted to smile, to nod, to say, "That was me." But you didn't, because the truth was a blade, and you'd spent your whole life dodging it. And eventually, if you were very unlucky, someone from your past would appear, not to kill you, not to threaten, but to recognize you. An old lover, a servant you once used, a fellow spy long thought dead. And in that moment, everything you'd buried resurfaced. The identities, the secrets, the weight. You'd share a look, a silent nod, maybe even a word. Then go your separate ways, both understanding that anything more would get you both killed. That was the cycle, the wheel that never stopped turning. Mission, flight, reinvention, silence, repeat. And the cruelest part? You weren't even the only one. There were others, dozens, hundreds maybe, all living the same nightmare. Different faces, same eyes. Eyes that had seen too much, trusted too little, and lived too long. There's a moment in every spy's life, often unspoken, where the weight of what you've done, what you've seen, and who you've become settles like a stone in your chest and refuses to be moved. It's not marked by a specific mission or failure or even betrayal. It creeps up gradually, silently, until you catch your own reflection in a river or the broken glass of a merchant's cart and realize you don't recognize the face staring back at you, not just because of the dirt or the disguise or the way your expression is hardened like cured leather, but because you can't remember who that person used to be. And that's when you understand that the worst thing about being a medieval spy wasn't the danger or the pain or the constant need to run. It was the loss of self, the slow erosion of the soul, until you became nothing but the shadow of your assignments. You started out with a name, a real one. A mother who whispered it with warmth, a friend who teased you with it at the riverbank, a lover who once moaned it in the dark. But somewhere along the line, that name stopped being yours. You handed it over, traded it for dozens of others. You became Thomas the mule handler, Elise the wandering midwife, Bren the mute charcoal seller. And over time, the name they gave you stuck more than the one you were born with, because it was the name that kept you alive, that got you past gates and into hearts and through doors that weren't meant to open for you. But the cost? Every time you answered to a false name, your real one faded just a little more, like ink left in the rain. Until one day someone asked who you were, and all you could do was lie. Not because you had to, but because the truth no longer fit in your mouth. And it wasn't just your name that you lost. It was your history. You couldn't afford to be sentimental, to carry trinkets or letters or relics of who you once were. You lived light, fast, forgetful. Memories became dangerous. Every detail of your past was a thread that could be pulled loose. So you severed them. You stopped writing down your thoughts. You avoided places you used to visit. You turned your back on holidays, family, and faith. Because every familiar thing had the potential to betray you. A song you hummed without thinking. A prayer you whispered before sleep. A dialect that slipped through when you weren't careful. You trained yourself to forget, and in doing so, you erased the person you had once hoped to become. Some tried to fight it. They carved initials into stone walls, sang lullabies into the wind, wrote coded diaries they buried under trees they never returned to. But it never worked. The life you lived as a spy didn't allow space for identity. You were a tool, used, repurposed, discarded. You became what the mission required. If you needed to be cruel, you were cruel. If you needed to seduce, you seduced. If you needed to kill a man who once saved your life, you did it with steady hands and empty eyes. Because the work came first, and the work didn't care about your tears. And yet, for all the lives you slipped into, for all the masks you wore, there were always ghosts. Not the ones you feared in graveyards or tales told at dusk, but the ones you made yourself. The people you lied to and left behind. The child who trusted you. The healer who welcomed you into her home. The apprentice who shared his bread with you and asked if you'd stay a little longer. You told yourself they'd be fine, that they'd forget you, but deep down you knew better. Because even if they never knew who you really were, they knew you. They remembered your eyes, your voice, the way you listened. And when you vanished, they wondered. And when the soldiers came or the fires started or the rumors spread, they blamed themselves. You haunted their lives just as they haunted yours. Sometimes when you were truly alone, hiding in a barn during a storm, or nursing a wound in the ruins of a burned monastery, you let yourself remember. Not the missions, not the kills, but the stillness, the moments between, a warm bowl of stew eaten by a quiet hearth, the sound of laughter you didn't start but were allowed to share, a dance you watched from a distance and for a few minutes believed you might join. You never did. You couldn't. But in that stillness, you felt the faint echo of a life you might have lived, one where you were just a person, not a weapon. And the ache of that thought hurt worse than any dagger. And what about love? Yes, it happened. Even spies weren't immune. But love was the cruelest illusion of all, because you could never love as yourself. Only as a lie. They loved the name you gave, the story you told, the version of you that didn't exist. And even if they loved you completely, wholly, desperately, you couldn't stay. You couldn't risk it, because love made you visible, made you predictable, and in your world, visibility was a death sentence, so you walked away, or lied, or disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving nothing but a memory that would slowly sour into confusion and pain. You told yourself it was mercy, that they were better off, but you never stopped seeing their face every time you closed your eyes. And so you lived on, carrying all the lives you'd borrowed, all the identities you'd worn like second skins, all the moments that might have mattered if you'd just been someone else. You didn't age the way others did. Your body aged, yes. Scars mapped across your skin, bones aching with the weight of winter and regret. But your spirit stayed suspended, locked in the years when you first learned how to lie, to kill, to vanish. You never grew out of it. You just became quieter, harder. You smiled less. You flinched at kindness. You distrusted comfort. Because every time you let your guard down, it ended in blood. Eventually, you became your own myth. You heard stories of yourself told by others, twisted through time and ignorance. Some thought you were a hero. Others said you were a ghost, a demon, a cursed soul who couldn't die. They didn't know you wept in the woods some nights, clutching an old name you hadn't spoken in years. They didn't see the way your hands trembled when a child looked at you too kindly. To them, you were legend. To yourself, you were barely real. And even as the world changed, new kings, new wars, new shadows, you remained. Not because you wanted to, but because you didn't know how to stop. Spying wasn't something you did. It was something you became. A state of being. An eternal vigilance. The life of a spy was a slow death by erosion, and by the time you realized it, you were already long gone. In most stories, there's a moment when the hero looks back at what they've done and sees something lasting, statues, songs, books written in their honor. But if you were a spy in the Middle Ages, that moment never came. Your legacy wasn't carved in stone or recorded in any royal chronicle. It wasn't passed down to grateful grandchildren or sung around fires by storytellers. Your legacy was silence, forgotten paths, unwritten lines and scrolls too dangerous to keep. The truth was that your greatest victories were erased on purpose, scrubbed clean from history because they were never meant to exist in the first place. That was the trade. You saved lives, prevented wars, collapsed conspiracies, and no one could ever know. Even the people who gave you orders rarely remembered your name. They remembered the outcome, not the architect. You could deliver the key information that prevented a siege, only to have a general take credit for a strategic decision. You could unmask a traitor within the crown's own chamber, and a steward would be praised for noticing inconsistencies. The best outcome you could hope for was surviving long enough to watch someone else bask in the victory you made possible. That's what being a spy was. Building ladders other people climbed, bridges other people crossed, fires other people warmed their hands by. You were the ash left behind. And if you did try to leave some trace of yourself behind, something small, something real, it had to be hidden. A name carved inside a church bell, a symbol painted under a bridge, a line of verse spoken only to the wind. Because if anyone found out you were involved, the work you'd done could unravel, alliances would be questioned, secrets exposed, reputations shattered. In the world of spies, being remembered was dangerous, not just for you, but for everyone you'd ever worked with. You weren't a name. You were a variable. One wrong mention and the balance tipped into chaos. Still, humans are not made for vanishing. We ache to be known, to be seen, and even the most hardened spy, one who'd cut ties, buried names, burned homes, still felt that ache late at night. Maybe it struck when they saw a village celebrating the peace they helped secure. Maybe it hit when they passed a temple and heard children learning to read, safe because of an assassination they'd carried out years before. You wanted to say something. I did this. I made this possible. But you didn't. Because to speak was to risk. And your silence, once a strategy, had become a condition you couldn't escape. There were others like you, not many, but every now and then, in a tavern or on a dark road, you met someone whose eyes were just as tired, whose movements were just as cautious. And there was a flicker of recognition, not of faces, but of experience, of shared ghosts. Maybe you exchanged a glance, maybe a drink, maybe a single phrase that meant nothing to the world but everything to you. It was the only kind of fellowship you had. Quiet, fleeting, haunted. And then you parted ways, both understanding that too much connection was too much danger. Sometimes you imagined what it would be like to tell your story, to write it down, not for fame, but for truth. A parchment hidden beneath floorboards, or sealed inside a crypt where no one would look for centuries. You'd start with your first mission, the one where your hands shook so badly you nearly gave yourself away. You'd write about the moments you were sure you'd die and the ones where you wished you had. You'd write about the people you lost, the lies you lived, the truths that never saw daylight. And at the end, you'd sign it, not with your real name, because that was long gone, but with a mark only you would understand, just to prove you existed. But the truth was, even if you wrote it, no one would believe it. The world didn't want the truth of spies. They wanted heroes and villains, knights and traitors, not the invisible hands that shaped kingdoms from the shadows. They didn't want to know that peace came from poison, that alliances were forged through blackmail, that the person they cheered for only lived because someone like you had made a quiet decision to kill. No, your truth was too ugly, too complicated, too dangerous. So even your story had to be buried. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was that the only people who could remember you, your handlers, your fellow spies, your rivals, were just as doomed to be forgotten. It was a cycle that consumed its own. You worked with people for months, even years, and then they vanished. Dead, disgraced, disappeared. And if you ever heard their name again, it was in a whisper or a warning. You couldn't mourn them, couldn't gather and share stories, couldn't mark their passing with song. All you could do was stay alive. And that was never a celebration, only a delay. Some said the church kept records, that deep beneath monasteries, guarded by monks who had taken vows of silence, there were archives, scrolls that held the real history, the unspoken truths. Some spies believed this, others laughed. Because even if such a place existed, you'd never see it. You weren't important enough, or maybe you were too important, and that's why your story would never be written there. You were one of the few who understood that legacy wasn't what you left behind. It was what you took with you. Secrets, burdens, names that had no gravestone. So you didn't live for legacy. You lived for impact, for moments, for the small things. A stolen plan that saved a village, a whispered warning that saved a queen, a night where you chose not to deliver the kill order because something in you still ached for justice instead of obedience. Those were your legacy, hidden, forgotten, but real. And if the world never knew, that was the price. Because in the end, the only people who would ever understand your story were the ones who lived it. And they, like you, had already learned to forget. There comes a point when the knife in your belt weighs less than the memories in your mind. A moment where the mission is long behind you, the names you once whispered are gone, and yet the silence inside you screams louder than a war drum. Because the danger might pass, but the damage never does. That's what no one ever tells you about a life in shadows. It's not the blade or the poison or the chase that breaks you. It's the stillness that comes after. When you're finally alone with yourself. When the world goes quiet and you have nothing left to lie to but your own reflection. That's when it all starts to rot from the inside. You see, survival had a cost that wasn't measured in blood. It was counted in years you never really lived, in joy you faked, in fears you swallowed so often they became part of your breath. When you're a spy, the adrenaline never stops. It becomes your heartbeat. Every door creak, every cough behind you, every sudden knock. They all trigger the part of your brain that was trained to flee, to kill, to vanish. You couldn't unlearn it. You didn't just act paranoid. You became it. And when the mission slowed, when the world stopped asking things of you, you realized the machine you built to keep yourself alive didn't know how to power down. You kept looking over your shoulder long after there was nothing left to see. That's when the nightmares began. Not just dreams of the missions gone wrong, of allies who screamed and didn't get saved, of doors kicked open too late or too soon, but dreams where you didn't know who you were. Where your hands held a letter you couldn't read in a voice that wasn't yours. Dreams where you wandered from face to face, town to town, never quite recognized, never quite forgotten, always halfway between being hunted and being erased. You woke drenched in sweat, knife in hand, convinced that your death had finally caught up to you. But the room would be empty, the walls cracked and quiet, and you'd sit there heart racing, wondering how many more nights you had left before the walls finally talked back. Some tried to cope with drink. It dulled the nerves, blurred the lines between friend and foe, memory and invention. You could convince yourself you were somewhere else, someone else, a tanner, a cobbler, a nameless wanderer with no history and no reason to wake before the sun. But the drink always wore off. And when it did, the weight came crashing back, twice as heavy and 5 times as cruel. Others turned to faith, to rituals, to superstition. They prayed to saints who had no names and burned incense stolen from monasteries they once infiltrated. They begged for forgiveness, not knowing what they were even guilty of anymore. Was it the lies, the deaths, or the simple fact that they were still breathing when so many weren't? You started to question everything. Not just the missions, but the world itself. Did your work matter? Did the deaths you delivered actually prevent anything? Or had you simply shifted the power from one monster to another? Were the kingdoms you protected any less corrupt than the ones you destabilized? These weren't questions you could afford to ask during the work, but afterward, after you had time to think, they clawed at your ribs. And the worst part was, you had no answers, because no one ever taught you what to do after. They trained you to infiltrate, to seduce, to steal, to kill, but no one taught you how to live with it, how to carry it, how to go on when the shadows no longer needed you. There were those who tried to start over, who found small villages and lived as farmers, scribes, even caretakers for forgotten chapels. They married, had children, tried to believe the past was a fever dream. But the past never stopped knocking. It arrived in the form of strangers with the wrong questions, in old enemies who had taken different names but still walked with the same limp, in a child's face that looked too much like someone you couldn't save. And when the past found them, those who tried to outrun it, they didn't die quickly. They unraveled, slowly, quietly. A wrong word at a feast, a panic attack in a marketplace, and eventually, a disappearance no one asked questions about. The strongest among you accepted the truth. There was no afterlife for spies. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. You lived on borrowed time. You were never supposed to make it out. You were a candle lit for a single night of fire, not a flame meant to last decades. And when the wick ran out, you either burned out quietly or exploded into something terrible. Some embraced it. They became mercenaries, informants, legends told to frighten children. Others simply vanished. Left their last name scrawled on a tavern wall, walked into a forest and never came out again. No one mourned them. No one told their story. And if someone did, it was always wrong. There were also the lucky few, not many, but some, who were taken in by people who saw through the mask and loved them anyway. A healer who knew the tremble in your hands wasn't just from old wounds. A stonemason who never asked why you always slept with your boots on. A friend who pretended not to notice when you flinched at certain sounds. And for a time they gave you peace. But even that came with guilt. Because every laugh felt stolen. Every moment of calm felt like a betrayal to those who didn't get out. You felt like you were wearing someone else's life, and deep down you waited for the day it would be taken back. And that's the truth, isn't it? That being a spy didn't end with your last mission. It didn't end with retirement. It didn't even end with peace. It just kept going. The habits, the silence, the secrets. They lived in your bones. They shaped your shadow. You weren't just a person anymore. You were the sum of things you could never say, of lives you'd touched and broken and saved and betrayed, and the world would never know. But here's the final cruelty. You didn't want them to know. Not really. Because the moment someone saw you, truly saw, you'd be vulnerable again. You might have escaped the enemy, the crown, the informants. But what you could never outrun was the memory of who you had to become to survive. And maybe that's the heaviest burden of all. If there was one thing the medieval world hated more than illness, more than famine, more than the wolves howling outside their village gates, it was the things they couldn't understand. And nothing was more terrifying to a medieval peasant, priest, or lord than the idea of someone who could walk among them unnoticed, speak like one of their own, and yet carry death, deception, and secrets beneath a calm smile. Spies weren't just distrusted. They were feared like demons, cursed like witches, and hunted like beasts. Because to them, you weren't just a person. You were something unnatural, a walking lie, a human mask worn by chaos. You have to understand the world they lived in. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. They knew the names of their neighbors, the faces of their village, and the rhythms of their rituals. Anything outside that bubble, strangers, different dialects, foreign customs, was a threat. And you? You didn't fit. Even when you blended in, they sensed it. You stood too still. You listened too closely. You asked questions with your eyes, not your mouth. And when things went wrong, when a crop failed or a merchant died suddenly or a noble was found poisoned, it was never fate. It was you, or someone like you. A shadow that moved too quickly. A man with no past. A woman with too much knowledge. They needed someone to blame, and spies made perfect monsters. The stories grew with each passing year. Spies could speak to crows, could vanish in fog, could poison wells by walking past them or cause miscarriages by whispering through walls. Some believed you were born of unions between devils and sinners. Others thought you were priests gone mad or angels fallen from heaven for using knowledge that wasn't theirs to hold. You were shapeshifters, ghosts, silent assassins who walked backwards in mirrors and drank ink instead of wine. And the best part? You didn't even have to exist for people to see you. All it took was one unexplained death, one missing page from a ledger, one secret that shouldn't have been known, and the villagers would find someone to accuse. And if it wasn't you, it was someone like you. A quiet widow, a stuttering stable hand, anyone who didn't fit. Superstition fed on silence. And you thrived in it. But that silence, that need for secrecy, also made you a target. You couldn't defend yourself, couldn't protest too much, couldn't afford to be seen reacting with fear or anger, because then they'd know. And once suspicion took root, it grew like ivy on stone, fast, tangled, and impossible to pull free. There were entire towns that burned strangers just to be safe, entire regions that outlawed certain herbs or colors or phrases because they were associated with spies and poisoners. And the irony? Many of these fears were based on tactics you yourself had used. You had hidden messages in songs. You had used herbs to paralyze and potions to induce confessions. You had snuck into castles in robes that matched the clergy and left behind not evidence, but questions. You created your own myth, and then became haunted by it. But it wasn't just peasants who feared you. Nobles, knights, bishops, they were worse. They knew your kind existed. They knew how close you could get, how fast you could undo decades of work. And that fear made them dangerous. A baron who thought a spy was in his court might kill 5 innocent men just to send a message. A bishop who feared infiltration might purge half his scribes. You were the reason they couldn't sleep. You were the reason they moved their beds, tested their wine, kept their family at arm's length. And even if you weren't there, the idea of you was. You lived in their nightmares. In some places, spies were blamed for everything. Storms, crops rotting, livestock dying. The phrase "he was touched by the whisperer" became a warning in northern villages, meaning someone had seen something they shouldn't have. Children were told stories of the shadow folk, people who wore other people's faces and stole voices. Not ghosts, not demons, just men and women like you. And that fear made your work easier in some ways. A frightened mind made mistakes. A suspicious lord isolated himself. But it also made every town a minefield. One wrong move, one mistaken identity, one unlucky moment, and you became the fuel for another legend, another fire. Some spies tried to use this fear. They adopted the image of the monster, cloaks too dark, movements too silent. They spread stories of their own deeds, left symbols etched in blood, whispered their own name into the wind so it would echo like a curse. It worked. People stepped aside. Doors opened. Secrets fell into their laps like fruit from a dying tree. But it came with a cost. Because once you become a monster, you stop being seen as human, even to yourself. And one day you look in the mirror and realize you've become what the world says you are. Something to fear, something to destroy. Others went the opposite way. They tried to blend so completely that even they forgot who they were. They took ordinary jobs, stayed in one place too long, made themselves small, quiet, unmemorable. It worked, for a while. But fear doesn't need a reason. It only needs a moment, a neighbor with a dream, a dog that wouldn't stop barking, a loose page with unfamiliar handwriting, and the pitchforks would come all the same. You learned to recognize the signs, the sudden quiet when you entered a room, the questions that didn't match the context, the priest who looked at you too long during blessings, the child who pointed and whispered. You learned to read fear like a map, and once it appeared, your time was limited. You had to vanish, change your name, burn your clothes, pretend you'd never existed. Because in that world, innocence didn't matter, only suspicion did. But the strangest thing? You understood them. Deep down, you didn't blame the people who feared you. You were dangerous. You had done things no one should. You had watched people live and die by your choices. You knew things about their world that would shatter their minds if you ever dared speak them aloud. You were the keeper of nightmares, and keepers are never loved, only feared, only hunted, and so you kept walking, village to village, court to court, never staying, never resting. Because you weren't just running from enemies. You were running from the stories, from the symbols scrawled on gates, from the eyes that stared too long at your shadow. You weren't running from death, you were running from being seen, because in a world full of fear, the most terrifying thing was truth. And you were truth wrapped in skin. Home. The idea of it lingered, distant and unreachable, like a memory that wasn't quite yours anymore. The concept haunted most spies. This notion that somewhere, tucked behind hills and hedges and winding rivers, there might still be a place where your name meant something, where someone remembered you before the lies and the blood and the vanishing acts. But the truth, the cruel truth, was that home didn't exist for people like you. Not anymore. Not after the years of masks and missions and running. Not after the things you'd done. You didn't return to where you started. You couldn't. You'd become a stranger even to the people who once knew you best. And worse, you'd become a stranger to yourself. Sometimes, in the quieter moments, you tried. You passed through the village where you were born, not as yourself, of course, but as a merchant, a traveler, a wandering tinker. You walked the street slower than you should have. Let your eyes linger on faces that looked older, worn down by time but still familiar. You watched children play near the well you once fell into. You heard the same bells that once told you when to rise, when to pray, when to sleep. But you didn't stop. You didn't speak. Because what could you say? "I used to live here" was not a sentence that meant anything anymore. Not after you'd spent years living everywhere and nowhere. Not after you'd learned how to erase yourself from every place you touched. You told yourself you were protecting them by staying silent. That if you said your name, revealed who you were, you'd bring danger to their doorstep. And maybe that was true. Maybe not. But the deeper reason was simpler, colder. You didn't say anything because you didn't know how. You'd forgotten how to be that person. The child who played with stones, who chased sheep up the hill, who cried when the stars were too bright and the wind too loud. That person had died long ago, not on a battlefield or in a dungeon, but somewhere inside you, smothered by necessity and protocol. You didn't come back because you didn't fit into that world anymore. You'd outgrown it, or it had outgrown you. And even if you found a new place, tried to build a life from the broken pieces of the old one, it never held together. You couldn't form connections the way others did. You didn't laugh at the right times, didn't trust easily. You observed everything, noticed details that no one else did. The ring on a man's finger that didn't match his family crest. The way a widow always walked with her left foot dragging half a beat behind. The smell of foreign spices in a town that had no port. These were things normal people didn't see. But you did. Always. And once you'd lived that way, you couldn't stop. Not even when you wanted to. Relationships became performances. Friendships were calculations. Every smile measured. Every glance analyzed. You answered questions with questions. You flinched when people got too close. And even when someone broke through, when someone looked past the distance and saw a spark of something real, you didn't know what to do with it. You'd forgotten how to receive kindness. It felt like a trap. You waited for it to be taken away, for the betrayal to come. And when it didn't, you left anyway. Because it was easier to disappear than to let yourself hope. Hope was the first step to being hurt. And hurt was something you'd grown too skilled at avoiding. You also feared routine. Most people longed for it, wanted quiet mornings and familiar paths. But you? Routine terrified you, because routine meant patterns, and patterns could be followed. Spies didn't live predictably. You changed towns before anyone remembered your face, slept in different corners of the same room, walked different routes even if it took longer. You didn't tell the same story twice. You couldn't afford to. Because the moment your life became recognizable, it became vulnerable. And so, you kept moving. Not because anyone was chasing you, but because if you stopped, the walls you'd built inside might collapse under their own silence. And there were other costs too. You didn't celebrate holidays. You didn't attend weddings or births or funerals, not even for people who mattered to you. You told yourself it was for their protection, that your presence was a risk. But really, it was shame. Shame at what you'd done, what you'd become. The blood on your hands, the lives you'd ended, the lies you'd told. How could you stand next to someone pure, someone untouched by war and secrets and betrayal, and pretend you were the same? You couldn't. So you stayed away. Lit candles in secret, whispered names into the wind and hoped that somewhere, somehow it was enough. There were moments, fleeting and cruel, where you imagined a different life, one where you were never recruited, one where you stayed in the village, became a baker, a weaver, a shepherd who grew old chasing clouds. You pictured yourself with laugh lines instead of scar tissue, with memories instead of ghosts. But these daydreams didn't last. They couldn't, because you knew in your core that you were never meant for that life. Even if you had been left alone, untouched by the gears of kingdoms and secrets, you would have wandered. Restlessness was carved into your bones. You were made to move, to search, to vanish. And that knowledge that even in peace you'd be running was perhaps the hardest truth to bear. Because if you couldn't go home, if you couldn't build one, then what were you? What was left? You were a story no one told, a shadow on the edge of the feast. A name erased from every ledger but whispered in the corridors of power when doors were locked and candles burned low. You were the sum of all the things you never said, the lives you borrowed, the truths you buried, and the silence you wore like armor. And so it ends, not with applause or mourning, not with a final mission or a written confession, but with a slow, quiet fading, like breath on glass, a candle burning low with no one left to watch it flicker. This was always how it would end. Not in glory, not in fire, not even in punishment. Just gone. A bed left cold in a town where no one remembers your face. A name spoken once in confusion by a barkeep who swears they saw you 10 years ago. A locked box in a forgotten monastery, holding papers no one will read. There is no grand finale for the spy who lives too long. No parade for the person who sacrificed everything but left no name behind. Only the echo of footsteps no longer taken, the soft creak of doors you used to open, and the silent question of whether you ever truly existed at all. This was the nature of the life you chose, or that was chosen for you. You were the architect of safety, the destroyer of threats, the reason some wars never began and others ended before they reached the innocent. But your work was invisible. It had to be. And so was your legacy. Your story was never written in ink. It was carved into the behavior of men who feared what they didn't understand. It lived in the laws passed quietly, in the glances exchanged between council members when certain topics came too close to the truth. You weren't remembered because you couldn't be. You weren't praised because praise made people ask questions. You weren't buried with honors because no one knew where to send the body, or which name to write on the stone. And perhaps the strangest part is, you understood. Deep down you agreed with it, because you had learned the one truth that unites all spies across kingdoms and causes and centuries. Silence is the only certainty. You couldn't trust rewards, couldn't trust your allies, couldn't even trust that what you did was right. But you could trust the silence. It never betrayed you, it never changed. It never asked you to justify the unthinkable things you'd done in the name of peace. Silence became your sanctuary, and when the time came, it became your grave. The world moved on without you. Kingdoms rose and fell. Languages changed. The names of rulers you once feared became footnotes. The battles you fought to prevent were replaced by new wars, new maps, new faces repeating old mistakes. And still your story remained buried beneath it all. The blade you once carried rusted in some farmer's shed, mistaken for a tool. The coded letters you once memorized decomposed into dust. Your life was swallowed by time and no one came to dig it back up. Because even if they did, what would they find? 100 lies stitched together by fear. A trail of shadows that led nowhere. But sometimes, rarely, a name would resurface. In a scroll found behind bricks. In a song half remembered by a traveling bard. In the expression of a scholar who studied one too many assassination attempts that never quite made sense. They'd ask questions, piece things together, wonder if there had been someone hidden beneath it all, someone who shaped history from behind closed doors. They'd never know the truth, not all of it, but they'd feel it, just a little, the weight of an invisible hand. And in that moment, you existed again, briefly. Like a breath in the dark. Maybe that's all you ever wanted. Not fame, not forgiveness, just to be known, once. To have someone, somewhere, whisper, they were here, and they mattered. And now, as the final lines of your story fade into silence, the truth becomes clear. You didn't fail. You weren't forgotten. You were the space between moments, the pause before the decision. The unseen force that stopped one blade and sharpened another. You didn't live a life that could be celebrated, but you lived one that changed the world in ways it was never meant to understand. And maybe, just maybe, That's enough. So if you've made it this far, if you're still listening, then maybe you understand something most never will. That history isn't shaped by kings or monuments or bloody battles on open fields. It's shaped by shadows, by the people who lived in the silence, who watched and waited and chose to act when no one else could. It's shaped by those who gave up everything, names, homes, hearts, even themselves, to protect something bigger. Maybe now you can see that. And if you do, then I ask just one thing. Stay a moment longer. Share this silence with me. And if this story moved you, even just a little, consider subscribing to this channel. Not because it helps numbers, but because this space, this strange little corner of the internet is built on storytelling, on voices that don't always get heard. And people like you, quiet, thoughtful, curious, are exactly who I want to keep building this with. Leave a comment. Not just a hello, but tell me something real. Share your thoughts, your favorite moment, or even your own story. Because maybe you haven't lived the life of a medieval spy, but I'd bet you felt invisible, forgotten, carried burdens no one else saw. That's what this community is about. Uncovering what's hidden and honoring what never got the spotlight. Thank you for spending this time with me. It means more than you know. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, even in the darkest corners of history, someone was always watching.